Big action scenes in blockbuster films or series can be really intimidating as a composer. I've had 6, 8, and even 12-minute cues land on my desk many times, and to be honest, they're some of my favorite sequences to work on. However, they can be really time-consuming. So, for example, a 2-minute action cue can take at least twice as long, if not much longer, than a 2-minute dramatic scene that's just piano and strings. So then, imagine when you have a sequence clocking in at 6 minutes, 10 minutes, or longer. As a result, having the ability to take these scenes on is hugely valuable. If you're looking to work for another composer, being able to take scenes like this off of their plate can instantly slingshot you to being the most valuable member of their team. On the other hand, if you're working on your own projects, knowing how to navigate such long and dynamic scenes is going to help you meet tight deadlines, and when they're composed well, it can really enhance the story, because these are typically important moments that act as the big payoff that viewers have been waiting to experience. So, as someone who's scored more action scenes than I can honestly remember at this point, and I can confidently say that so far I've built my career on how well I execute them, these are 5 tips for scoring long action sequences. So number 1 is to create contrast. In long scenes, contrast is king, and not every second should be head-banging action. If the scene is edited well, it should have an arc and chapters, which includes some breathing room. So when it's a long scene and the music is just blasting through every second, it's gonna cause fatigue to the viewer and also cause the scene to sort of lose its shape and interest. When going over the sequence, either in your spotting session or on your own, look for moments to let at least some of the music breathe or change it up entirely. Try taking the rhythm out completely, or just allowing something like the long strings to take over. I personally have found it really helpful when spotting the picture myself to look for areas where you can intentionally be as subtle as possible, and then you blast back in full throttle. Here's an example using a piece of music from one of the series I work on. Listen to how we go from a full, exciting arrangement to something very thin and minimal. As you can hear in this example, we're going from a really big crescendo to something that is much more subtle and much more eerie. And then you can hear it blast back in full throttle to create that really dramatic change. The next 2 tips build on this idea of creating contrast even more, starting with number 2, modulate or change keys. When I do change keys, they're typically done strategically, and what I like to do is break the picture up into levels. What I mean by that is that a sequence will usually start at a certain level of intensity, and as the action progresses, it should build an arc like it's its own mini story. So I look for clear moments when things level up, or there's a shift in the story, and we want the viewer to feel like the stakes have just gotten a bit higher. This is where I'll usually go up a whole step like this. So as you can hear, we're in the key of B during the beginning part of what I just played you, but if you look where this marker is that I've highlighted, that's when we're hitting the C sharp and we're moving up a whole step. The whole scene just moved forward, something happened, character broke free, or there was a progression in the story, so we moved up a whole step to signify that in the music and also keep the music building and moving and interesting. After we level up, it's sort of like the intensity cycle starts all over again. So I'll usually start either building on the idea I began at the first level, or maybe I'll start introducing new musical textures entirely until the next level of the scene takes hold and we modulate again and continue the process of moving the scene along with the music. So it's important not to do these modulations too close together. To reiterate, these key changes are for moments where it's very clear that the story is trying to escalate or the stakes just got higher, and this usually allows the sort of change in the music to feel natural and typically fits the picture well. So that's how I use modulation when things keep moving forward for the characters in the story. Oftentimes in long action sequences, there's almost always a setback. Maybe it's an unexpected explosion that turns the tide of battle against the heroes, or it could be like a major character becomes critically wounded, something dramatic like that. And in these moments, I'll typically drop a minor third, which sounds like this. So you can hear where I started playing this piece that we've got this really gritty action sequence happening. It's actually a big cowboy bar shootout that's taking place on screen, but then what happens is one of the main characters gets taken hostage, and so the whole tone of the scene shifts, and by dropping that minor third down to a C sharp, we can really feel and follow the story musically with what's going on. Instead of feeling like everything is moving forward musically, I feel that this sets the tone for things becoming much more dire and that there's been some sort of emotional or dramatic setback. My next tip is one that is super important, and that is to change up instrumentation. This again harkens back to my first tip of creating contrast, and in this case, I'm talking about switching instrumentation up entirely. So for example, if you've been using the orchestra a lot, especially spiccato strings for pace and action, or big brass, look for a moment in the story that has an emotional shift and maybe just go to all sound design. So replace the orchestra with distorted pads or maybe a synth pulse. Another technique I'll use is to take out tone entirely and maybe just let the percussion and atonal or dissonant sound design take over. So here's a couple examples of that. So here's like a full kitchen sink arrangement. And now we've changed the arrangement so it's the same musical idea, but it's a little bit different and it keeps things interesting. And another big change here, we've stripped everything but percussion and now building sound design. So that's like a perfect example of changing up the instrumentation to keep things interesting. We don't lose the adrenaline for a second, but the music is always shifting and evolving in a natural way so that the scene doesn't start to feel like white noise as it plays on and the action continues to build. The point is, it really helps the story to stay engaging when you can create contrast by bringing new colors musically into the mix. Moving on, the next tip for scoring long action scenes is number 4, working with the sound effects and not against them. Some composers I know get really insecure about how loud their music is going to play back, especially when there's large sound effects. So while it's important to make sure your music is able to cut through so that it sits well in the final mix, it's my opinion that sometimes sound effects can be much more effective at telling the story, even during long action sequences. If there's a moment where maybe the tension builds to a break and then there's a huge explosion, a building collapses, or there's just some huge gunfight, it's okay to say, hey, let's pull the music out entirely. Let the sound effects take over and allow the scene to just breathe. Even during scenes when music is playing over sound effects, you don't want to necessarily throw the kitchen sink at the composition just for the sake of being bigger than the sound effects. In a great story, every element should be there for a reason. In my opinion, the element of your music is no different, and it shouldn't be there just for the sake of being there. Instead, it should always serve a purpose, and if there's an opportunity to give it a rest, when the music eventually comes back in, it'll be much more impactful. So the point of this tip is your job isn't to battle with the sound designers, especially during action scenes where both music and sound effects are doing a lot of heavy lifting to match the visuals and the pacing. Working together so that each element really shines through and serves the picture as a whole is what your job is all about. My very last tip about scoring long action scenes sounds quite easy, but honestly, it can be really difficult to do, especially on a tight deadline, and that is stepping away. In my experience, when scoring these long and intense scenes, there's usually a day or two of getting all the ideas out and trying to create the shape of the cue, but eventually, I personally have to step away. Doing so actually saves me time because if I just try and plow through and keep on writing, oftentimes I'll burn out and end up redoing large segments. My personal approach for long action scenes is to aim to score at least 3 minutes a day. Then once the sequence is done, I can move on to other cues for a day or two, and I'll eventually come back to the big scene to check things out. This helps to give me a fresh perspective, and honestly, I most commonly find myself taking things out to make my intention more clear musically. It's really easy at first to overscore because I'm initially approaching the scene from a mindset of pure creativity. However, when I eventually return after taking a break from the cue, my mindset is more like an editor. It's much more technical of an approach. So even things I may have written that I loved, I oftentimes might decide I either need to thin out or I just delete them entirely because with fresh ears, I can hear that it's not serving the scene as well. I cannot emphasize enough how effective it is to take time away from a really large cue and then try making it better when you've had time to reset. So that wraps up this video about scoring long action scenes. I hope that you have the opportunity to work on some extensive action sequences yourself. I personally find them to be a lot of fun to score, and if you apply some of these techniques that we've discussed in this video, I'm hoping it'll make the process a bit less intimidating for you. If you find this sort of content helpful, please just take a moment to like the video and subscribe to my channel, because doing so allows me to create more free content just like this. Also, make sure to check out my educational website, modernmediacomposer.com, where you can sign up to receive free virtual instruments and more exclusive educational content that's relating to scoring for film and television. I really appreciate you taking the time to check out this video, and as always, I hope it's been helpful.